In the book of John, chapter 6, Jesus teaches us that the Eucharist truly is his flesh and blood, and that we must eat of him. There are some Protestants who object to that interpretation of John 6, and they believe that Jesus is speaking metaphorically or spiritually. But just in John 6, 51 through 58 alone, Jesus tells us 6 times that we must eat his flesh and drink his blood, and that his flesh is truly food and his blood is truly drink. And when Jesus is telling us that we must eat his flesh and drink his blood, the word in the Greek that he uses is estheo, which generally means, it's the word that they use for eat, but then he switches to trogo, which is a more intense gnawing. So whenever the crowd is questioning Jesus' teaching about eating his flesh and drinking his blood, instead of clearing all this up and saying it's just symbolic or metaphorical, Jesus actually doubles down on his language and says that we must gnaw on his body. Another point where Protestants object to this is in verse 63, Jesus tells us that the flesh is of no avail, it's the spirit that gives life. But my question to anyone who uses that verse to disclaim Jesus being literal about eating his flesh and drinking his blood is, if Jesus is saying that his flesh is of no avail, that wouldn't make sense, because as Christians we all believe that Jesus' flesh is what saved us when he was crucified in the flesh on the cross for us. So when Jesus says that the flesh is of no avail here, that wouldn't make sense if he's talking about his own flesh, because he's God. But rather, the flesh is used in the Bible to describe our fallen nature or our human understanding. So it's the spirit that we need to rely on to believe and understand these things. And those who walked away from Jesus' teaching and were offended by it, they were not being led by the Spirit, but rather by their flesh. And another interesting aspect to John 6 is that in the beginning of John 6, we see that the Passover is at hand. So this is exactly a year before the Passover feast where Jesus instituted the Eucharist. Now, there are instances in Scripture where Jesus uses metaphors to describe himself, like the door or the vine. And we don't believe that Jesus is truly a wooden door, but that's not comparable to this episode in John 6, because in John 6, Jesus repeats himself over and over, and he tells us truly, truly. And he even doubles down in his language and uses the word for gnaw whenever the crowd believes that he's speaking about eating his flesh and blood. So instead of correcting the crowd, Jesus actually doubles down on his language, and he even lets these people walk away from him because of his teaching.